You are valid and allowed to just say, so for that reason, I'm calling it on this relationship, right? Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming back if you've been here before, or hi, welcome if you're new. My name's Mickey, I'm a therapist, and we talk about therapy things on the channel. Today, we're talking about weaponized therapy speak because I made a video recently about weaponized boundaries, and I mentioned offhandedly, if y'all want me to talk about weaponized therapy speak, let me know, and a bunch of you did, so we're talking about that today. I'm not gonna bore you with my preamble. Let's just get into the thing. Okay, so first and foremost, I wanna talk about what weaponized therapy speak actually is. In my opinion, there's like sort of, it's like an umbrella term, and there's like stuff under the umbrella here. I do think it's important to address that when we talk about weaponized therapy speak, sometimes it's malicious, right? Sometimes it's abusers like Jonah Hill who tried to weaponize the concept of boundaries to mean that his girlfriend wasn't allowed to wear swimsuits even though she's a surfer, which is fucked up regardless, to be clear, but especially so in that context. But also that like his boundary for being in a relationship with him was that she wasn't allowed to have boundaryless friendships with other men, which is not how boundaries work. We're going to get into more detail about like why that's wrong and why that's bad later. But like, yes, weaponized therapy speak does very much happen in this abusive context where it's like specifically with malintent. And also I want to talk today about like the misuse of therapy terms, because to me, I think these go together. And it's important to acknowledge that not every time somebody misuses or weaponizes therapy language are they an abuser, nor are they necessarily doing it on purpose, which is why we're talking about this. I'm hoping to like provide some education, and hopefully we can do some introspection for our own selves. I'm gonna talk about that for myself later. You get it. One thing that I wanna talk about before we move forward is that sometimes when we misuse therapy speak, the perception is that it's only being weaponized at others, right? Oftentimes it is like this intent to use very like science-y or like therapy-y words to sound as though we have like the moral or like the intellectual high ground, right? Like I'm using these definitions and so therefore I'm smarter than you and definitively right. And it does sometimes also happen for ourselves, which I think is important to address as well. Sometimes we have this desire to like over intellectualize, especially if you're a person who like thinks your feelings rather than feels your feelings. You might be familiar with this, where we'll say these things about how like, you know, it's not safe for me to be on Tinder because I have an avoidant attachment style, and so I know that I'm going to be triggered by like X, Y, or Z, and so I'm just choosing to not do that. Instead of just saying like, I'm afraid of rejection. Tinder scares me, right? Both of those things are true. Both of those things are very valid. Both of those things have valuable information in those statements, but one of them can be used to avoid or like circumvent the vulnerability of just like distilling something down to its core essence to be like, I'm afraid, right? And I think there is value in having this conversation because again, like when we misuse therapy terms or like default to this very intellectual type of language for ourselves, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's definitely not abusive in that context. And I do want to encourage people to steer away from that sometimes because again, there's power and growth in the vulnerability of just like, again, distilling that down to its core essence and being like clear about like what we're actually saying. That said, I want to talk about some examples of what weaponized therapy speak actually looks like. We did kind of talk about this already with the Jonah Hill thing, and I obviously just gave you some examples now, but I also want to talk about what this looks like because again, I think it's important to sort of break this into two sections here, which is that sometimes it's perpetrated on behalf of people who are genuine abusers, who are doing it with malicious intent, and sometimes it's like accidental, either for ourselves or at other people. So I want to start with the like abusive stuff first. I think that's probably important to educate about first and foremost. We talked about Jonah Hill already, but I also want to talk in more broad strokes because I think it's impossible for me to give an exhaustive list of like really descriptive examples. I think we're better served by having like a broad strokes conversation here. So the thing I want to encourage you to remember about people who are abusive or being manipulative by weaponizing therapy speak is that it's often done with the intent to manipulate or to coerce you, right? There's usually an air of condescension in there as well. Again, of like, I'm like so intellectual and I'm so much smarter than you, and so therefore I'm definitively right. And there's also an energy of like intentionally trying to pathologize somebody else's behavior. This is kind of at the core too of this conversation, which is that it's, I think, morally neutral for people to accidentally misuse therapy terms in just like describing something incorrectly, right? Not everybody is a therapist. And so people are going to use therapy terms wrong. That's fine. I don't have beef with anybody who does that. However, when we're using therapy terms to pathologize, again, either ourselves or other people, especially in an abusive context, that fucking sucks. And I think it's important to call attention to the fact that at the core, when we're weaponizing therapy speak, we're using these terms with the intent of telling somebody else you're wrong, you're broken, you're bad. Very much the energy of like, what's fucking wrong with you, right? And it's like very judgmental and again, very condescending. So oftentimes this will look like somebody who's really selfish getting labeled as a narcissist, right? Because there's this air of like, I'm not just saying my opinion is that you're selfish. I'm labeling you definitively as a clinical narcissist, which carries more weight. And so therefore I'm correct, right? This is at the core of why this is a problematic behavior, because instead of uplifting our own personal opinions, which everybody is allowed to have, right? I think that's also like an important rabbit trail for us to take for a moment, which is that we don't need a good enough reason to feel the way that we feel. We're going to talk in more detail about this later, but oftentimes when people default to this language of trying to pathologize someone else, it's because we feel as though we need like definitive ground to stand on, right? And I want to encourage everyone to just remember that if you don't like someone, if someone hurts your feelings, if they have like a repeated pattern of behavior that fucking irks you or is an ick or it just like doesn't feel good to be around, you don't need a label or like therapy speak to justify saying, I don't fucking like you, right? I don't like you. I don't like this interaction. I don't like the way that you feel. Or that like you make me feel. And so you are valid and allowed to just say, so for that reason, I'm calling it on this relationship, right? You're allowed to do that. And I think it's just important to talk about how like this language oftentimes, again, is just used to like uplift this point and try to give ourselves like a one up. People use this language a lot as a trump card and like, you don't need to do that. I know that the vast majority of people who are watching this video probably aren't the people who need that PSA, but still for what it's worth, I think it's worth discussing. Some other examples of like how abusive people will weaponize therapy speak are when somebody will call someone like a pathological liar, right? Somebody who just repeatedly lies is not necessarily a pathological liar. There is a world where that does exist and that does happen. And the vast majority of the time, what someone's trying to communicate actually is like, you've lied to me a bunch, and so I don't trust you anymore, right? Another example of this is that if your perception of events don't feel like they match mine, therefore you're gaslighting me. This also happens a lot in like an internet context where like we'll tell people you're being a gaslighter because you don't agree with me. And like, I hate this. This one probably pushes my buttons the most. This and calling people abusers because they simply hurt your feelings, right? And again, I'm not talking to you, this proverbial you get it. But people who are abusive will do this where they say, you know, oh, you're gaslighting me because you won't let me essentially steamroll you with my perspective, right? Or because you reacted emotionally after I poked and prodded and poked and prodded and poked and prodded and like, you know, paper cut you to death, therefore you're being abusive to me, right? You're emotionally reactive, you're unstable, and you're being abusive to me, right? You're triggering me, you're making me feel unsafe. This is why it's important to talk about because first of all, oftentimes that's not true. But second of all, the weaponization of this language is like so mindfucky for people. This is why I'm such a stickler about people using the word gaslighting, by the way, because being gaslighted is a horrible experience. It's horrifying. It's really scary. It causes you to distrust your very perception of reality. And it's really, really, really destabilizing. It's like a very severe trauma that people have to recover from. And it's not just as simple as someone telling you that like, that's not how that happened. Or like, I don't remember it that way, right? So please do be cautious about the use of the term gaslighting and abuser because it's a weighty word that like holds a lot of gravity. And I think we should use it with the appropriate gravity. Whatever, you get it. And so I just want to encourage people to be aware of this too, because if you notice there's a person in your life, or especially if you've been on the receiving end of this behavior, you will recognize how scary it is to come to this realization of like, hold on, this person has been telling me that I'm abusive, that I'm reactive, that I'm unstable, that I'm unsafe. And actually, I think it's the other way around. This is a really difficult realization for people to come to because when you're being gaslighted and when people are using therapy language to gaslight you and to like fuck with your brain and your perception of reality, it causes you again to distrust yourself. And also you need oftentimes a lot of time and space and validation and support and reinforcement from your safe people to get to this place where you're able to kind of overcome this like self-judgment or self-labeling. I guess it's not self-labeling if someone's doing it to you, but you get what I'm saying. And so this is a really difficult thing to come back from, but also again, this is important to pay attention to. Okay, before we go any further, I want to talk to you about this week's sponsor, which is Sunday's Food for Dogs, because for real, it is the best dog food that we've ever bought, and I'm really excited to share it with you guys. Sundays for Dogs is a healthy dog food that's made out of human-grade ingredients. The company was actually co-founded by a veterinarian, but unlike a lot of other high-quality human-grade dog food brands, it's air-dried, so that means that it doesn't need need to be refrigerated, which I love. The air drying was the real game changer for Aaron and I because our dogs are our children, obviously. And I feel strongly about giving them the best of everything, but especially food. But having to store and prepare refrigerated food was just like not a realistic option for us. And so Sundays is really nice because we can just pour it and serve it, but we can also use it in their snuffle mats and their puzzle feeders, which we couldn't do with refrigerated food. And like also we need to use snuffle mats and puzzle feeders because with their old dog food, it was really common for us to sit there and give us the like, are you serious look? But with this, we have to like actively slow them down. They love this food. I feel so good about feeding our dogs Sundays because it's really high quality for them, but it's also easy and convenient for us. And I want you guys to experience it too. Sundays is also hooking it up for real because when you click the link in the description and you use code Mickey at checkout, you can get 50% off of your first order. So go click that link in the description, get 50% off of your first order while you can. Genuinely, I'm being so serious. I love this dog food. And also show Sundays some love for showing me some love. Thank you again to Sundays for sponsoring this week's video. Let's go ahead and hop back in. The other thing that's important to talk about in this realm is also that people who are genuinely being abusive and misusing these therapy terms on purpose are doing it to silence others, right? This is also part of this issue with using the word gaslighting inappropriately and for people who are using it as an abusive tactic. It's intended to silence the people that are being abused by literally gaslighting them into thinking that they are the ones who are being abusive. This is, again, why I feel so strongly about it. I'm not going to bore you with the speech a second time, but you get it. Before we wrap up this section and move on to the like more accidental or misuse section of this video, I also want to talk about in this realm of people who are being abusive, it's also common for people to use the word like toxic and to say that like you're violating my boundaries by doing something that I don't agree with, basically. This is a really common flavor of this that's really problematic, and I want to encourage people to be aware of this and to recognize this. We talked about this a little bit with the Jonah Hill thing, but for the sake of clarity, anyone who tries to tell you that their boundary is that you're not allowed to do something is so wrong. Like, this is not an okay thing to do. We're going to talk in a second about the nuance here and that sometimes people do this accidentally. Caveat, you get it. However, especially if you're noticing that like somebody does this repeatedly and that there are a lot of very stringent and strict rules around what you're allowed to do because they call them boundaries, this can turn into abusive behavior very, very quickly. So please be very wary of that, not just in your own selves, obviously, but especially in people doing that to you. If something like that doesn't sit right with you, I do very, very much want to encourage people to speak to your safe people about it, right? We will all land in different places with whether or not it's safe for someone to confront their abuser specifically, but one thing that is very much a safety promoting behavior is to talk about what's happening with people that you know are safe. This is like the way that people often are able to like realize that they're being abused, first of all, but also then escape and find safety from abusive situations. So please know if something doesn't sit right with you, especially if somebody is doing these things to you, know that it's okay and that you should be talking to your safe people about this. Oh, really quick, also just as a final caveat, this is also why it's really important as a therapist and for those of you who want to be therapists or whatever, to be aware of these behaviors and to not engage as a clinician in a situation that from the outside is very obviously abuse, right? When we give abusers a greater vocabulary from which to pull in these abusive situations, we provide them essentially with like greater and more efficient tactics to abuse people. This is unethical. If you as a therapist are aware that there is abuse going on, the work is in like, first of all, labeling that and being like, listen, I can't safely or effectively be a therapist for you because in my opinion, this relationship is abusive and I can't participate here. It's not ethical. There is no amount of like couples therapy that will convince an abuser to not be an abuser. Like, that's not how it works. There is greater work to be done on an individual level. But again, if you're a therapist or a prospective therapist, please know that like engaging in these situations, while it can feel tempting to be like, oh, well, if we just educate enough, no, like it's not safe. It's not ethical or healthy. Please do your due diligence in not providing abusers, again, with a greater vocabulary and tactics from which to further abuse people. I now want to talk about in my opinion, this section of the video might be kind of unpopular, but like, sue me. I want to talk about the like accidental misuse of therapy terms and also when we weaponize therapy terms, not as a like blanket abuser with malicious intent, like on purpose, because I know that like, obviously it's important to educate about the abusive part of this. And also, I think it's fair to say that a good amount of the time, it's more common for this to be happening in a more like accidental or like not quite with such specific malicious intent. And it is really, really useful and important for us to be reflecting inward. This is why we talk about a lot of the stuff that we talk about on the channel, because we can't control other people, right? But we can control ourselves and the attention that we're giving to ourselves and our own behaviors. And so I want to encourage folks with this section to like bear with me. So one example that I wanted to talk about with this is that like when we do this, right, when we're weaponizing therapy terms, oftentimes from the same place of like wanting to say like I'm right and you're wrong, but not necessarily from an abusive lens, it is still shitty, but it's also, again, oftentimes accidental. I think like the best example of this actually is in season 3, I believe, of Welcome to Plathville. Olivia does a lot of her own work in therapy around boundaries and like her own like self advocacy, which is great, obviously. We love to see it. Good for her. This is an Olivia Stan account. And also in this moment where she tells Mariah, one of the siblings, you're not allowed to have your parents here. Or like, in essence, your parents aren't allowed to be at this concert at a public venue because I'm going to be there and that makes me uncomfortable, right? This is literally the weaponization of therapy terms by saying you're not allowed to do something because that's my boundary. She wasn't being abusive. She didn't do this on purpose. She didn't do this with malintent. And it did still happen, right? This is very, very common. This is also why I wanted to talk about this, because this is very common for folks who are new to therapy or are just like learning about these therapeutic terms, and especially people who have survived a fair amount of childhood trauma. It's common for there to be like a learning curve with using these terms and these concepts appropriately. So this happens a lot, right? Generally speaking, a better reframe around those boundaries would be that like, if your parents are going to be here, that makes me uncomfortable. And so therefore I'm going to excuse myself, right? Or like in this moment, I'm choosing to not censor myself. And so I'm not going to pretend like I'm okay with it when I'm not, right? Maybe that means I'll cry. Maybe that means I have like, not kind interactions with these people. Maybe that means I choose not to talk to them. All of those are boundaries for yourself, right? Because boundaries are a self-guided behavior that allows us to communicate efficiently. This thing is not okay, or like this is a limit about what I'm willing to accept in my relationships. And if this thing should occur, this is my response to that, right? Again, I think it's important to educate about this because it's a very, very common misconception. And while it's not abusive in nature, again, it is still shitty and it is still a thing that generally speaking, we want to move away from and like improve our knowledge around this issue. The other thing that I want to address about this, again, especially for folks who have survived a fair amount of trauma in their lifetimes, is that this is a common stumbling block because when we, especially in childhood, if you're a person with CPTSD or with childhood trauma, when we have experienced this feeling of being not heard, of being not validated, of not having a voice, it's common for us to feel this sense of like want or desire for like legitimacy, right? There's often a need to feel as though our emotions can be legitimized through objective or like scientific-y sort of concepts. And so that's where this pull comes from. A lot of times when the weaponization of therapy speak is happening from a non-abusive lens, it's because we're trying to grasp onto these terms to say, see, like how I feel is allowed and is valid, and you should listen to me. Usually this is a trauma response of folks feeling like, again, you weren't heard, you weren't validated, no one cared or saw you. And so now that we have this language to describe what it is that's going on that's like bad or shitty on behalf of someone else's behavior, there's a desire to pull towards these terms. And this is why I said at the beginning of the video, I want to encourage people to remember that you don't need a good enough reason to feel how you feel. You don't need like a valid reason. You don't need like a legitimate reason or proof or receipts to say, this isn't working for me anymore, right? I don't like this. It doesn't make me feel good. It's not fun. Straight up not having a good time. And so therefore I'm removing myself. You're allowed to do that at any time. We've talked about this in a couple of different realms on the channel, but like specifically about relationships, right? Like you don't need a good enough reason or to be like allowed to break up with someone, to go no contact or low contact with a family member, to choose to get a divorce, to end a friendship, right? You're allowed to just say, because of my feelings, I'm doing this thing, right? This is kind of at the core of like how to deal with this advice. We'll talk about how to deal with like when somebody's being abusive to you in a second. But for ourselves, I want to encourage people to do the introspection and to recognize and notice, like, am I using these therapy terms to try to find the sense of legitimacy that I feel like I've lacked in childhood or in my past relationships? And if that's the case, practice, first of all, like reflecting inward. Taking space is always a good bet for what it's worth, but reflect inward and ask yourself, like, what is the core essence of what it is that I'm trying to communicate, right? By saying, like, I don't know, you have triggered my abandonment trauma by showing up late, and so therefore you're not a safe person for me to be friends with anymore. The essence of that is that, like, you showed up late, that hurt my feelings, maybe because of a past history or trauma that I have with other stuff. And so my knee-jerk reaction is to like revoke my friendship from you out of like either a sense of punishment or a sense of like justice, or feeling as though like it's not okay for me to be here, right? Practice communicating that like, you did this thing and it made me feel bad. Like the core essence of that is that like you did a thing and it made me feel this way. Communicating in this like more vulnerable way, first of all, obviously this is only applicable if it's safe for you, but you get it. But communicating in this more vulnerable way is going to do a couple of things. First of all, it's going to help your brain to rewire itself in the sense that like, again, I don't need a therapy concept to be underlying my motivation in order for my want or feelings to be legitimate. And it's also going to help be a connecting moment in these relationships. When you're in a relationship with a safe person, being able to communicate, you did X, Y, or Z, and it made me feel A, B, or C. First of all, that's a lot easier to understand. Second of all, it's going to help decrease like the defensiveness and the like, nah, that people have. And again, it's also going to be this moment where you're able to like really provide someone with an opportunity to see you. If they're a safe person who's worthy of being in relationship with you, they'll pick up that ball that you've left on the court and like run with it, right? This is a good moment. This is why I want to encourage people to engage in this way, because what happens when we weaponize this therapy language, again, in a non-abusive context, is that it sort of bird's eye views us, right? Like we're removing ourselves from like the actual meat and potatoes and like the real guts of a human interaction, which is where those connecting moments come from. So not only are you like telling yourself that I need a good enough reason to feel how I feel, which sucks, you're also potentially missing out on this connecting moment with somebody that you could really love or trust if we're able to work through a conflict rather than trying to circumvent around it by using very like intellectually language. The other thing about this is that it oftentimes is a desire for us to make what is actually a very gray issue black and white. The other like piece of reflection, again, I know that this part of the video is probably a little unpopular, but the other piece of reflection I want to encourage everyone to do is remembering that relationships are inherently the gray area, right? There are very few definitive black and white lines when it comes to right or wrong or allowed or not allowed in relationships, barring abuse and all of those types of things. You get it. And so in trying to foster healthier and safer and more stable relationships, part of that is going to be like embracing that there is gray area in relationships and that we won't necessarily have a definitive answer for all of the questions or conflicts that we come up against in a relationship, and that that's okay. I do also want to pause here and be clear that I'm obviously like speaking about this as a clinician because like I'm a therapist and I've learned things, but also as a person who has very much done this work, right? I have had to work like really hard actually to unlearn my like therapy vernacular, both because it just becomes a part of your language as a clinician, but also because I am very much the like fear of vulnerability person. And I can like personally vouch for the fact that my relationships and my conflict resolution looks a lot calmer. It looks a lot more caring, and it also feels a lot more connecting at the end of it. So do practice the introspection here and like be aware of how that might be showing up for you. And if you notice this happening for yourself, practice taking a moment to like really reflect and again, ask yourself like, what is the core essence of what I'm trying to communicate here? And can I communicate this with less official terms, right? Can I lean into vulnerability or honesty or transparency or authenticity in this moment with words that feel more like my specific vocabulary and less like therapy textbook vocabulary? For what it's worth, this is why the work is really hard for therapists, because there's sort of a blurring of the lines that happens there. And so especially if you're a person who's done a lot of work in therapy or you're very aware of therapy terms, you might notice this happening for yourself too. But stick with it, practice checking in with your own vocabulary and vernacular and like really getting comfortable communicating things in a way that feels like you intrinsically rather than like what we've learned from therapy. Also, for what it's worth, it's always a good reframe to remember that conflict is not about winning, it's about connecting, right? So in these moments where you feel this pull towards that sense of legitimacy or like needing a good enough reason, remind yourself that anybody who's worth being in a relationship with doesn't want to win, they want to be connected with you. Okay, that said, I want to talk about how to deal with this. Before we get into the like concrete strategies that I have, I do want to be super clear. This only works if it's safe for you to do this, right? Please don't use any of this advice. Use your best discretion to make sure that if you're choosing to enact any of these strategies, that it's because it's safe for you to do that. If at any point you feel emotionally, physically, spiritually, psychologically, or otherwise unsafe, disengage, right? Get the fuck out of there. You don't owe anybody an explanation about that. And again, you don't need a good enough reason to feel how you feel. If you feel unsafe, then it's unsafe and you have permission from me and yourself and, you know, whoever, to disengage. That said, if you notice this happening, one of the things that I think is most helpful is to just call this out onto the carpet, right? Especially if you have like an inkling that someone is doing this not from a like genuinely like malintent abusive place, but rather the like accidental weaponization place, calling that out onto the carpet and saying like, hey, I feel like you're labeling me a lot, or I feel like you're talking a lot about me and I'm not really hearing a lot about like your feelings, right? I want to understand what you feel, what you think, what's happening for you, but I feel like we're labeling me. So can you just like, first of all, stop labeling me, but second of all, can you use language that's not quite so therapy-y, right? Along with this, again, this advice is only applicable for people who are accidentally weaponizing therapy language, or maybe weaponizing it from like a, you know, from a not like genuinely abusive place. For what it's worth, if somebody is being genuinely abusive to you, or like is doing this from a like place of malintent, the advice is disengage, right? There's very little that you can say to an actual abuser that will, if not nothing, that will actually be effective, right? People who are committed to being abusive or manipulative or just like unsafe ass fucking people, there's nothing that you can say, right? We can suck ourselves into this paradox of like, well, maybe if I explain it correctly, or if I explain it enough, or if I say it kindly, or if I say it enough times. No. People who are abusive, people who suck, people who are unsafe and mean, there's no, like, you can't be a good enough victim to make them stop abusing you, right? And also, you shouldn't need to be. You shouldn't need to be good enough or kind enough or smart enough or, like, explain things good enough in order for them to not abuse you. That sucks. So, like, generally speaking, if someone's actually being abusive to you, the advice is fucking disengage. This advice is more so for people who are accidentally weaponizing this language. In an instance like that, try to be aware of your own self, because oftentimes if somebody has a grievance with us, that can activate a lot of defensiveness, like understandably so. That's a very human thing, but try not to one-up anybody, right? If you notice somebody using therapy language with you, especially if this has been an issue for you in your own self, you might feel the desire to like then start therapy labeling their stuff, and that's not helpful, right? Remind yourself also that if somebody has a grievance with you and they're voicing it in this very therapy-y way, it's entirely possible that they are working through their own stuff, right? And so if it's safe for you, again, practice reminding yourself that you can be a person who's wounded others and still be a good person. And so that we can be like receptive of people's feedback. Generally speaking though, again, I want to encourage people to just call this out onto the carpet and like bring that into the room. More often than not, anybody who has like actual good intent and is like just accidentally weaponizing this language will be receptive to some degree, so that you guys can have like a more effective communication about whatever's happening. That said, I want you guys to ultimately remember that at the core of this conversation is the truth that you don't need a good enough reason to feel how you feel, and you don't need the perfect words or vocabulary or like therapy language in order to be valid or like allowed to feel the way that you feel and to want the things that you want. And again, anybody who is worth being in a relationship is going to be receptive in some form or fashion to you just stating your feelings authentically, genuinely as they are, rather than trying to rely on this language. And also, if you notice this happening to you, please know that you're very valid and allowed to call that onto the carpet if it's safe for you to just be like, no, right? Like, I don't like that. That's not working for me. And also to draw a boundary around that, right? If somebody is weaponizing this language at you and they're not receptive to this in the moment, it is okay for you to be like, hey, love you, want to have this conversation with you, not like this though, right? So like, I'll see you in 30 minutes or in a month or fucking whenever. We'll revisit this conversation when it's safe for us to do that, but I'm not engaging in a communication that feels like this, right? That's your God-given right. You're allowed to do that. And I think at the core of this video is really just the advice that like you're allowed to feel how you feel and you can disengage at any time for any reason, as long as we're doing it in a way that is like, somewhat kind and respectful. Okay. I don't know why. I feel like I didn't really talk for that long, but I'm like legitimately losing my voice. So I'm going to go. If you guys like the video, you can like the video. We do talk about stuff like this. We also do podcast episodes on Thursdays and live streams on Fridays that I would love to have you guys stay for. So go check those out. And that said, you guys can share the video to help the channel grow and to help each other grow. And I will see you guys next Saturday. Okay, bye.